was well known by employees of the Port Arthur Historic Site that the fire exit door itself was nailed shut. This was reported quite clearly by Wendy Skua, who was an employee at the Port Arthur Historic Site.
Turns out that had been nailed up.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. There was some talk about it having a faulty lock, but then I heard that it was nailed. So who would have nailed it?
That lock was a cover-up. That was a cover-up, the faulty lock business. They went to a lot of trouble with that.
Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. It's generally known that the biggest mass shooting in Australian history at the time by a lone gunman, which was the Port Arthur Massacre, had an outrageous lack of investigation in that there was no coronial inquest, no royal commission, and no open trial for the convicted perpetrator, Martin Bryant. A crucial aspect of a coronial inquest into something as major as Port Arthur relates to the state mandate that whenever there is death by violence, death by firearms, for instance, death by fire, or if foreign tourists died on Australian soil, that generally it's requested, it's mandated that there must be a coronial inquest. The magnitude of Port Arthur alone, in terms of a crime, should have warranted such an inquest, but the coroner at the time, Ian Madison, had commenced an inquest and then discontinued that inquest. In essence, basically preventing any kind of coronial findings in relation to the Port Arthur Massacre. There is a lot of, for want of a better term, legal wrangling over the legitimacy of being able to quash a coronial inquest. There was certainly pressure from our then Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, and Ray Groom, who was the former Premier from Tasmania, to not continue with a coronial inquest, ostensibly on emotional grounds, that the notion was they didn't want to drag victims and survivors through a trial that might go on for a long amount of time and revisit the horror of that day, which, in my opinion, is just outrageous. Of all the crimes that have been committed over the decades in Australia, the Port Arthur Massacre should definitely have warranted a coronial inquest from a number of different viewpoints, if you like. The first is the crime itself, because we did have multiple deaths by violence and fire. When the Seascape cottage had been set on fire, the owners were found deceased inside and incinerated, along with Glenn Pearce. There were, of course, foreign tourists that were visiting the Port Arthur site on the day, and some of those had lost their lives. There were victims, there were people injured. There, of course, is the fallout from the trauma of just being present and experiencing something like that. There's been some investigations into the Coronial Act that applied at the time of the massacre. Ostensibly, the decision for the coroner, Ian Madison, not to continue a coronial inquest was utilising terminology that applied from a 1995 amendment in the Coronial Act to the original 1957 Coroners Act. The 1995 amendment to the Coronial Act, which was enacted virtually just before Port Arthur, changed the parameters whereby a coroner had to go through a number of processes to be able to sign off on a coronial inquest. In essence, it allowed a lot more relaxation in terms of being able to follow through those processes, to be able to discontinue without giving any kind of detailed, reasoned explanation. This was ratified by the coroner, Ian Maddison, when he sent a letter to some of the survivors from Port Arthur saying that he had commenced a coronial inquest but had decided to discontinue the coronial inquest, particularly if his findings would be inconsistent with those of the Hobart Supreme Court. This is terminology that actually exists in the coronial legislation. In essence, it's saying that if there was some kind of discrepancy between the findings of the coroner and those of the Hobart Supreme Court, that there was opportunity or avenue for the coroner not to be able to continue with an inquest. However, given the timing of the legislation, and after much research, I have discovered with the assistance of a colleague that the Coronial Act that was in force at the time was the 1957 Act, which was a lot more stringent in regards to the processes that had to be carried out by the coroner in order to fulfil his coronial responsibilities. So the 1995 Amendment Act wasn't actually brought into act, so to speak, or given what they call royal assent until after Martin Bryant had been convicted. So, in essence, Tasmania was still operating under the 1957 Coronial Act, and that there were processes that were a lot more strident in regards to the coroner carrying out his required duties. Whether or not those processes were completed is still under investigation. However, there is certainly a degree of questioning about whether or not the correct process was followed in that case. Now, separate and associative to the decision to not have a coronial inquest and the consequent call of outrage very much for there to be a coronial inquest, related specifically to the operation of the Port Arthur historical site itself, which was a government-run site. Now, this is very important because as a government-run tourist site, which was open to people from all over the world and from all over Australia and the locals, there is a very strong requirement for duty of care in regards to work health and safety, the occupational health and safety in the running of that site, even back in 1996. The Broad Arrow Cafe, which was purchased by the government and incorporated into the Port Arthur historical site, was open, of course, for tourists to be able to gain refreshments and to eat a meal. Like most buildings, irrespective of whether they're government or not, there is a requirement for public amenities to have a fire exit. Of course, in the case of emergency or fire, that there are alternate sources of exit for anybody that is facing any kind of emergency. On that tragic day of the 28th of April 1996, the cafe was very crowded. There were a lot of people there. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, and the cafe was doing a thriving trade. When the shooter had entered the Broad Arrow Cafe and begun firing, of course, panic set in, and there were a lot of people in a fairly confined space. Now, some of those had attempted to escape through the Broad Arrow Cafe fire exit door, only to discover that they could not escape. As a direct result of that, 7 people lost their lives, contributing, of course, to the horrific figure of 35 people killed and 28 injured. Investigation was, of course, carried out into why the fire exit door did not act as a fire exit during the shooting. Initial reports were that the door lock itself had been inoperable, that there was in essence a fault, and much effort went into determining the mechanism of the lock and what had gone wrong. However, this was discounted and very much found to be a cover-up, because it was well known by employees of the Port Arthur historic site that the fire exit door itself was nailed shut. This was reported quite clearly by Wendy Skua, who was an employee at the Port Arthur Historic Site, and by Stephen Howard. Now, the reason the door was nailed shut was ostensibly because with a fire exit door, you can only, in essence, gain egress from the inside out. But if the door is propped open, for instance, for any particular reason, then you can gain entrance through an alternate doorway into the cafeteria and the nearby gift shop. There were reports that there was some shoplifting and thievery, and as a result, to prevent that from anyone propping the door open, that it was nailed shut. This was later confirmed by a colleague of Wendy Skua, who had confessed that her husband had been responsible for nailing the door shut.
The door, the fire door, it wouldn't open, it was jammed. That 6 bodies stacked up there in that corner, and they all been trying to get out the door. And Damien Buck said nobody tried the door. I thought, well, how do you know? You weren't in there. But anyway, I tried the door because I wanted to help and get those people one off the other. But I couldn't reach them. Dead weight, you know. Anyway, I tried the door, and I realised the door handle went up and down, but it wouldn't budge. And it turns out that had been nailed up.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. There was some talk about it having a faulty lock, but then I heard that it was nailed. So who would have nailed it?
That lock was a cover-up. That was a cover-up of the faulty lock business. They went to a lot of trouble with that. And I know now why it was done. It was done because people were stealing stuff from inside the cafe. Because you can't lock a fire door from inside. So the only way they could stop that door from opening and people stealing things was to put a couple of 3 or 4 6-inch nails in. And that's what they did. Anyway, I think we need a coronial inquiry.
It's astounding to me that Howard squashed that.
Another thing going back to that door, I found out about that door. In fact, it had been nailed up 3 weeks before. There's a girl down there that I was nursing with, and her husband was the man that nailed the door up. And she approached me and she said, you know, Wendy, she said, I think that door being nailed up is what broke out American. And I said, why do you say that? She said, John nailed it up. He told me.
Now, irrespective of the determination to secure the door in that manner, or the person that was either directed to do so or took it upon themselves to do so, what we have is a very clear and adamant need for a coronial inquest from a work health and safety perspective alone. Now, many of the survivors from Port Arthur, particularly the employees, and principal to these was Stephen Howard and Wendy Skua, was an adamant call for a coronial inquest into why the fire exit door had been nailed shut. Stephen Howard had profoundly lost his young wife, who was working in the cafe at the time, and he was also an employee at Port Arthur. So their calls were for there to be a coronial inquest.
I couldn't get my head around it. I just didn't understand how there could not be an inquiry. Ray Groom just said it'd be a rake over of the coals. The people involved don't want it. I was involved. I wanted it.
And this was in relation to the health and safety issues at the site.
The door was the big problem. The door.
They, of course, assumed that this would be massive, that this alone would cause a huge legal headache for the Tasmanian government, and were then consequently outraged and shocked when told that there would not be a coronial inquest into the locked door. To this day, there is calls for an inquiry into all aspects of the Port Arthur Massacre, and particularly the inoperable, I won't say inoperable, the nailed shut door is a fundamental aspect of that. So although the 1988 Workers' Rehabilitation and Compensation Act did not preclude government employees from receiving compensation for breaches of work health and safety, there was, if you like, a very convenient clause whereby employees could not sue the government unless they could prove that there was serious, deliberate misconduct in relation to a work health and safety breach. You could imagine with a crime of this magnitude that the payout to employees who had not only had to suffer the losses of loved ones, but also had to deal with the aftermath of the shootings on the site. Having to, in some cases, Wendy Skua was there for hours in the cafe courageously performing triage in what would have been a scene of absolute carnage. Just the post-traumatic stress disorder itself would have been and was catastrophic amongst survivors from Port Arthur, particularly the employees. In regards to all of the other unanswered questions about the tragedy, this, of course, compounded the outrage, the shock that there wasn't any kind of thorough investigation into the failure of the fire exit door on the site. It's also of concern too, and some question, that there were many foreign tourists who had also experienced the same level of trauma. Some had been killed, some had been injured, and many had, of course, witnessed the horror of the day. And there is some question about why there would not have been some independent civil cases launched against the Tasmanian government from foreign nations whose civilians had lost loved ones or been injured. The payout by the Tasmanian government would have been astronomical, and yet there seems to have been, for want of a better term, some kind of avoidance to a culpability, a responsibility and an accountability for such a monumental failure on the part of the government. So I guess that the locked door is somewhat of a mystery because, once again, as with all things with Port Arthur, there is a lot of contradictory claims about why the door did not work. And the inoperative lock was considered by Wendy Skua to have been a cover-up, as she says in her own words. A Coronial Inquest should certainly have occurred with Port Arthur, and if not that, a Royal Commission. But we had neither. And so here we are once again, decades later, with no answers or no adequate answers as to why such a crucial aspect of failure by the Tasmanian government has not been taken into account. Thank you for joining the Wasp Files. Please feel free to share far and wide and see the Dropbox link on the YouTube channel and some of the material that is also available on the Facebook page Wasp the Port Arthur Massacre, which is free to download in support of some of the episodes. Also, please see the link to the Buy Me a Coffee page, which helps support the channel and keep us running. And keep watching, and every Tuesday night there'll be new episodes of the Wasp Files up for you to view. Thank you.